High class, Abraham Lincoln just won the presidential 1860 election with only 39% of the popular vote. He was not even listed on the ballots in the southern states. So what is the state of the nation? The South feels tyrannized and underrepresented. The North feels they must be the conscience of the nation. If you listen to my pending crisis lecture and read the chapter, you'll understand even more. Tragically, class, the United States will soon be splintered and fractured into many pieces. Civil war affects everyone. Statistics are staggering. 500 deaths per day on the average. 2/3 of the soldiers will die from disease rather than battle. So for every 3 soldiers who die in battle, 5 more die of disease. Brothers fight brothers. Families are ripped apart. Recent studies say about 750,000 soldiers will die in the U.S. Civil War. So what are we fighting for, class? The North and the South say they're fighting for different things. The North is fighting to keep the Union together in the beginning. The South, we're fighting for our way of life, we say. On December 20, 1860, South Carolina called for a special convention and voted unanimously to withdraw from the Union. 6 other states will rapidly follow, and in February of 1861, they meet in Montgomery, Alabama, and form the Confederate States of America, the Confederacy. They elect Jeff Davis as president, and this is a picture on the slide of his swearing in at our capital here in Alabama. Southerners then proceeded to seize as many federal forts and property as they could. They did not really have enough power to completely take over places like Fort Sumter off the coast of South Carolina or Fort Pickens in Pensacola, but they are able to lay siege to them. Northerners are very confused and upset at this secession of so many southern states leaving the Union. Attempts were quickly made at compromise. It failed. John Crittenden, a representative from Kentucky, offered the Crittenden Compromise. This amendment would guarantee the permanent existence of slavery in the South and extend the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific Ocean. For goodness sakes, let's just give them what they want, right? But still, the South is riding high on their horse straight out of the Union. They believe King Cotton diplomacy will save them. According to South Carolina Senator James Henry Hammond, you dare not make war on cotton. No power on earth dares make war on it. In Lincoln's inaugural address, he gives the nation his view. No state can secede legally, and the government will hold all federal property in all ceded areas. Lincoln's main concern, class, was the preservation of the Union at all cost. So to Lincoln, the immediate crisis was not the slavery question, but secession. At Fort Sumter, they were running short of supplies, so Lincoln tries to send in a relief expedition. Let's send a message to the South, we mean business. The new Confederate government has a choice here: submit or be aggressive, and they chose aggression. Confederate forces under P.G.T. Beauregard attacked the fort and for 2 days fired the first shots of the Civil War. Lincoln's relief was turned back, and Commander Robert Anderson at Fort Sumter surrendered. So, class, the Civil War has officially begun. There's actually some border states between the North and the South I wanted to point out who would not secede, like Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland. West Virginia is on this map as not seceding because they only became a state during the Civil War. They're the only state to apply for statehood during the Civil War, and they applied after breaking away from Virginia in 1863. They for sure in West Virginia do not have slaves in the mountainous Appalachian region, and they do not plan on fighting for them. Clearly, the North will have a material advantage. Populations twice as large as the South. Advanced industrial system is producing goods. Transportation is good. They have a better railroad system than the South. The South class, though, is very committed to this war effort, and they really believed Europe's dependence on cotton would bring them over to the Confederacy side. The South has well-trained military leaders. Still, the population in the South is only 9 million, to the North's 22 million. They do have 4 million slaves, but they don't count them, and of course they don't want them involved in the fighting. The North has disadvantages in that their opinions are divided and shaky about why we're even fighting. They're going to be unfamiliar with fighting on Southern terrain. And the South's disadvantage clearly is that they have no industry to speak of and will need imports to survive. Billy Yank is the personification of the Northern soldier who will fight in the Civil War, or the Union, part of the Union. Political cartoonists use Billy Yank and his Confederate counterpart, Johnny Reb, short for rebel, to symbolize combatants in the Civil War in the writings of the day, the poems, and the songs. Under Jeff Davis and his Vice President Alexander Stephens, the Confederate States wrote their Constitution. It was identical to the Union, except it legally sanctioned slavery and acknowledged states' rights. But they're going to have many uphill battles mobilizing troops to fight this war, as will the North. They begin to take economic measures in the North to continue their development of the railroad. They reestablish a national bank to create more financial stability, and new taxes will help, as will borrowing. Bonds are important, too, for the financing of the Civil War. Still, everyone is going to need soldiers. The United States Army at the time of the Civil War only had 16,000 men at the eve of the war. Lincoln authorized volunteers to be called up for 3-year terms. That's not going to be enough because by March of 1863, enlistment was on the decline and 200 men were deserting every day. Congress will pass a national draft law, like we're going to see in the South. Enlistees could purchase a substitute for $300. Folks are going to go crazy, and the draft is going to set off a series of northern riots. The worst was in New York, where over 1,000 people will die. The South is not much better. They don't even have an army, so they too pass a conscription act to help with manpower shortages. But where's the South's money going to come from? All of their capital is tied up in land and slaves. Income tax won't help very much in the South, and they try to print some paper money. It just leads to inflation. The exemption for Southern soldiers could be purchased, as well as in the North. If you owned a plantation or a farm with at least 20 slaves, you automatically got an exemption. According to one writer of the time, it's a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. By 1864, the Confederacy will be forced to extend the draft to cover men from age 17 to 50, and later they're going to try to force slaves to fight, but that's going to be absolutely to no avail. They were running away to join the Union, slaves were, so why was desertion so high on both sides? Daily hardship of war was characterized by thirst, hunger, forced marches, battles, extreme cold, heat, disease, little or no pay, family issues back home, lack of confidence in their leadership, and even the Union actually didn't start off very good either. But as the war progresses, the Northern Union Army will ultimately prevail, as we'll see. Free blacks will rush to enlist. Establishment of the Bureau of Colored Troops leads to an all-black units being formed. Unfortunately, they will be led by white officers. 186,000 black Union soldiers in all. 93,000 of those ran away from Confederate states to join, and 40,000 were the free men, slaves from border states and from the North. Mistreatment of black soldiers was common, like segregation from white troops, and they were often given substandard supplies and rations. Black soldiers received $7 per month plus $3 for clothing, while white soldiers received $13 per month and $3.50 for clothing. Black troops strongly resisted this mistreatment. The 54th Massachusetts Regiment, for example, served 1 year without pay rather than accepting unfair wages. It will be 1864 before the War Department in the Union sanctions equal wages for black soldiers. thanks in part to a black soldier named James Gooding, who wrote Lincoln a letter. Sadly, he will die a prisoner of war at Andersonville, Georgia. Of course, Abraham Lincoln will be the most important asset to preserve our Union. Today, many believe he's the best president we've ever had. He was intelligent, full of integrity, articulate, and had an acute sense of timing, being able to grow and develop as a person while he was in office. He wasn't perfect, but he was what we needed at the time. His goal was to destroy Confederate armies, not territory, but he couldn't find a general who would do it. He went through a series of unsuccessful leaders, and it's going to be 1864 class, 3 years into the war, before he finds what he's looking for in Ulysses S. Grant. Grant agrees with Lincoln's strategy, destroying the enemy forces and their resources, and then destroying the will to fight. Grant is, by many, considered a military genius, and he will later become our 18th president. Robert E. Lee had a choice to make. He was already in the Union Army, and Lincoln offered him command very early on. However, he will choose to follow his home state of Virginia into the Confederacy. He was a shrewd tactician, a battlefield commander, winning numerous battles against the Union armies. Yet his northern invasions will ultimately lead to defeat. Lee will become a great Southern hero of the war and a post-war icon of the lost causes of the Confederacy. And as the politics of emancipation begins to emerge, we're going to see problems. The Republicans of the North, they disagree about what emancipation should look like. Radicals wanted our war, the Civil War, to abolish slavery immediately and completely. Conservative Republicans favored a gradual plan. Lincoln was conservative at first, and in 1861, Congress starts with confiscation acts. Let's declare slaves used for insurrectionary purposes to be free. So if you were held as property in a Confederate state, you were actually free. They added a second act to declare free the slaves of persons aiding and supporting the rebellion, and it authorizes the president to use freed slaves as soldiers. But the aim will eventually lead to emancipation. Only emancipation can justify this huge loss of life and finances that's occurring. So in 1862, Lincoln announces the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, but class, it only frees states living in rebellious Confederate states. Again, it defines the principle of the war aims for the North. We're now fighting to eliminate slavery and preserve the Union, but the irony, according to Seward, our Secretary of State, is this. We show our sympathy with slavery by emancipating slaves where we cannot reach them and hold them bondage where we could set them free. Lincoln just did not want to antagonize the slave border states that were loyal to the Union by setting their slaves free. It's going to be the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865 that will constitutionally make slavery illegal. The first major battle of the Civil War will be the First Battle of Bull Run in Northern Virginia. It's also called the First Battle of Manassas by the Confederates. The Union, if you didn't already know this, names battles for land areas, and the Confederacy named battles for local creeks, rivers, and bodies of water. When the Southern Confederate troops under the leadership of General Stonewall Jackson began a counterattack with a horrifying rebel yell at the Battle of Bull Run, Union troops panicked and fled. Retreat was complicated because civilians were out picnicking and watching the battles. Can you imagine? The Confederates were disorganized too, and they didn't pursue. This loss to the Union will be a severe blow to their morale. But the real outcome is that Americans begin to realize this is not going to be a short or a glamorous war. People are going to die. It really fueled the war fever in the South. We won at the Battle of Bull Run, Battle of Manassas. Union goals lead them to try and cut the Confederacy in half. In 1862, New Orleans will fall to the Union. This is where some ironclad ships will help. And they begin to work their way up the Mississippi River. This is going to really start crippling the South as they're losing their largest city and headquarters for banking and commerce in New Orleans. Grant meets the Confederacy at the Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee in 1862. And Confederates, with the leadership of also Johnson and Beauregard, start out winning, but lost on the second day. Johnson will be killed, and all hope will be lost to keep the Union out of Mississippi. So the Union can now say it controls the Mississippi River all the way to Memphis after the Battle of Shiloh. General Lee and Stonewall Jackson went on the offense again at Antietam Creek. On September 12 in 1862, it'll be the bloodiest day of the war. 6,000 die and 17,000 were injured in one day alone. Antietam is also called Sharpsburg Creek, was a Union victory, but just barely. This has really taken way too long. The Emancipation Proclamation has now been issued, but weak commanders are not helping the Union cause. On paper, the Union should be winning. It's going to take destroying the morale of the South to win, but they have a very firm resolve, thanks in part to this wartime propaganda machine churning away in Southern papers. 1863 will be a pivotal year in the war. The Battle of Chancellorsville was a Confederate victory, but Stonewall Jackson is accidentally shot by his own men and ultimately dies. Robert E. Lee is never the same. Jackson had been his right-hand man from the beginning. Grant, in the meantime, Ulysses S. Grant, is laying siege to Vicksburg, Mississippi, and it lasts 6 long weeks. Vicksburg surrenders to Union troops on July the 4th, and the Union now has control of the length of the Mississippi, and the Confederacy is split in two. General Lee begins to advance north. He felt if the Confederacy could have a win on Union soil, England or France might come to their aid. But in Pennsylvania class, he met the Union Army at Gettysburg in July of 1863. This is the most celebrated battle of the war for sure. The loss at Gettysburg will be the costliest for the Confederacy, and it is a turning point for the Union. The Confederacy will never really fully regain from this loss. The Confederacy loses over a period of several days 51,000 men. The South will never take the offense again, and they're never able to replace their losses from Gettysburg. The advance to the north is over. In the meantime, at the Battle of Chattanooga, with Confederate morale very low, Union forces will take control of the Tennessee River. Sherman will be unstoppable by Confederate forces, and by late of 1864, he takes Atlanta in September, burning it to the ground. According to one famous writer, Atlanta was gone with the wind. He proceeds to march toward the sea and lives off the land. He cuts a 60-mile wide strip through Georgia. Sherman was determined to make war as horrible as possible, and he sought to destroy the will of the Southern people by burning, destroying, and demoralizing everything in his path, and he succeeded. He reached Savannah on December the 20th and presented it to Lincoln as a Christmas present. According to Sherman, war is hell. Lee class will surrender the Confederate Army at Appomattox, Virginia on April of 1865. Lee surrenders in dignity, and Grant allows the Southerners to return home on their own horses with pride intact. Tragically, on April the 14th of 1865, Lincoln is shot and killed. That's going to lead us to another story for another day. So, class, the war ensures the permanence of the Union, but many other issues are going to remain far from settled. What will happen to the former slaves, now free men? Can the North and the South reconcile? The end of the war was really the beginning of generations of struggles to determine the legacy of the Civil War. And is the Civil War over today? According to one Southern mother at the time, you must fear God, love the South, and live to avenge her. And as you'll see, the myth of the Southern Lost Cause has influenced many future generations. Class, your generation gets to decide if we're working to unify our nation or keep it divided. It's up to you. As usual, class, keep in touch.